way down in the green woods where the animals all play. They do things and they say things in a different sort of way. Instead of saying purple hat, they all say herple pat. Instead of saying feed the cat, they just say keep the fat. So if you say let's beat a rook, that's Billy as can see. You're talking Runny Babbit talk, just like Mim and he. That was actually from Shel Silverstein's legacy, continued in the release of a new work. It's called Runny Babbit. It was his actually first posthumous publication, and it was actually completed before his death, but it was released in March of 2005, so that was actually after his death. The funny thing about Shel Silverstein is that he never intended to be a writer. His style is very unique and it's all his own. He actually, when he was speaking in an interview to Publishers Weekly in 1975, he stated that he felt lucky that he didn't have anybody to copy, that he didn't have anybody to be impressed by. It allowed him to truly create his own style and to have his own personal way of doing things, not only in his writing but also in his illustrations. He grew up in Chicago, Illinois. He actually, after graduating high school, attended the University of Illinois, but was actually flunked out of the university. But then a couple years later, he continued his education. After he graduated from Roosevelt in 1953, he was drafted into the Army. And then 2 years later, he was honorably discharged in 1955. He actually, while he was in the Army in both Japan and Korea, drew for the Pacific Stars and Stripes newspaper in the 1950s when he was over there. He did illustrations that were more for adults, but they were still in his own personal style. His first book that was actually published was called Lafcadio and the Lion Who Shot Back, and that was in 1963. The funny thing about Shel's works were that he took them to several different publishing houses and was turned down by all of them actually at first, because he was told that they didn't quite fall into adult literature, but they didn't quite fall into children's literature, and just back and forth, and he had a really hard time with that. His third book was actually his first book that was illustrated in full color, and it was also his first poetry collection book, and that was in 1964, titled Uncle Shelby's Zoo, Don't Bump the Grump, and Other Fantasies. Shel Silverstein often referred to himself as Uncle Shelby. This kind of just created a personal level between him and his reader and made it really child-friendly. Silverstein's book Light in the Attic was published in 1981, and that was the first children's book to be on the New York Times bestseller list. It was actually on there for a record-breaking 182 weeks. Silverstein published his books in more than 30 languages, and he also has a total of 11 children's books, including several of my personal favorites. As a child, the first of one of my favorites is The Giving Tree. It introduces the concept of giving to the child and also parallels it with the receiver's capacity to give love in return. And it deals with a little boy and an apple tree, actually, which is something that isn't a normal concept for a child to have a love relationship with the apple tree, but I think it conveys the concept in a good way, in a fun way for a child. My second favorite of his is A Giraffe and a Half. It deals with a lot of just impossible things that happen, including a giraffe growing to twice its size and carrying different things on its back, and just a lot of fun things that just will make you giggle when you read it. Silverstein actually has quite a passion for music, which I feel like could be a huge contribution to why he has such a knack for poetry. He actually wrote a song for Johnny Cash. He wrote the song A Boy Named Sue, and he also has received a Grammy for his album for the book of poetry, Where the Sidewalk Ends, and it is recited, sung, and shouted by the author. Silverstein's also written a number of plays, and he actually co-wrote a film called Things Change. That was in 1988. His last book that was published in 1966, before his death in 1999, was Falling Up, and that was also a book of poetry. Not only in children's literature, but also in other aspects, but a huge part of his contribution was to children's literature. He is somebody that I think should be considered one of the pillars in children's authors. I truly do feel like Shel Silverstein's books have been a huge staple in my childhood. Not only his poems, but also just his books. I still remember to this day sitting in my grandma's giant orange fuzzy chair in her living room next to an enormous plastic tree, which I never understood why I was there in the first place, but reading Giraffe and a Half and just her stumbling through the words sometimes and me just in awe of the crazy pictures of a giraffe and a little boy and just wishing that I could be the child that was there witnessing all this silly stuff happening. And I'm excited to honestly share his works with my children and also with my students someday, being able to read those to him as well. Through his literature, Shel Silverstein really introduced a new world to children. Actually, one of his poems is titled New World, and it says, "Upside-down trees swinging free, buses float and buildings dangle. Now and then it's nice to see the world from a different angle."